Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the fifth in a series of programs I'm doing on one of the great wisdom writers in the Western tradition, the American Ralph Waldo Emerson. He is perhaps best known as a proponent of individualism and self-reliance. Emerson lived for ideas. He lived for insights. He believed that one of the very important purposes of life was to try habitually to move to higher levels of awareness, of consciousness. Emerson, time and time again, talked about the immense power of ideas. Here's a quote from him illustrating this. He said this: "The ideas in every man's head make him what he is." He also said this: "Life consists of what a person is thinking about all day." Perhaps the best biography ever written about Emerson is a book entitled Ralph Waldo Emerson, The Mind on Fire. The Mind on Fire by Professor Robert Richardson. I highly recommend the book, and I think the title is quite appropriate. On the subject of intelligence, Emerson believed that the most important kind of intelligence was the ability to distinguish what is true from what is false about human nature, about oneself, and about life. He believed that particular species of intelligence was and is far more important than having an intelligence for mathematics or science or even an aptitude for speaking and writing well. Emerson was born in 1803 in Boston, Massachusetts. And as I have pointed out in previous programs, he lived almost his entire life in Concord, Massachusetts. He died in 1882 at the age of 79. Emerson had three main careers. For 5 years, he worked as an ordained Protestant minister. In fact, was the head of the parish of a particular church in Boston. He resigned from the ministry in his early 30s, and the reason he gave for resigning was that he said that he could not distribute communion on a weekly basis because he did not believe that that was Jesus' intent. This, by the way, was a sign of many things to come in Emerson's life, because in so many ways, Emerson proved to be a nonconformist. After leaving the ministry, again in his early 30s, Emerson took up the career of lecturing and later of writing essays. And it is for his essays and some of his books that he is most well known. As I pointed out in previous programs, Emerson is considered to be one of the great essay writers in the Western tradition. Emerson wrote about the human condition, and he stimulates our thinking about what we can all do to live more fulfilling lives. Emerson was an unusually candid person. His writings were and are provocative, sometimes even inflammatory. And what were some of the themes of Emerson's lectures and essays? Well, among them were friendship, education, love, religion, suffering, human nature, solitude, and heroism. And that really just scratches the surface. Emerson wrote so many essays, it would take quite a time to list the themes of all of them. An important theme of Emerson's was solitude. Indeed, he wrote a book entitled Society and Solitude. And in this book, he evaluated both the advantages and disadvantages of interacting with other people in society, and also the advantages and disadvantages of solitude. And again, when he's talking about interacting with people in society, he talks about the many ways in which we can do this. We interact with people in the office, possibly a social club, possibly a church congregation, a school, a social gathering, for example, such as a party, a bar, or a coffee house. Since Emerson primarily made his living from lecturing, giving as many lectures as 80 in a year, and giving these lectures in many parts of the United States and also in Europe, Emerson did have considerable contact with other people. In other words, he was a very active member of society in many ways. But also, Emerson spent a lot of time alone. He spent a lot of time reading and preparing his lectures and writing books. And also, like his good friend Henry David Thoreau, Emerson loved nature and loved to take solitary walks in the woods. While Emerson believed that we need both contact with society and we need solitude, his preference was for solitude. He would agree that we need other people, but that we also need to get away from other people. He would agree with the idea that we need conversation, but that we also need silence. And what did Emerson specifically have to say about the upside and the downside of interacting with other people in society and also of being alone in solitude? Well, among the advantages of interacting with other people, Emerson cited the following. He said, when we are active members of society, it means we can interact with a wide variety of people and come to a better understanding of people and human nature, and begin to understand the wide range of beliefs and behavior among the people in society. Emerson also believed that another advantage of being an active member of society is that it can help us to understand the difficulties and the frustrations all people experience in life, and therefore can help us to cultivate empathy and compassion for other people. And according to Emerson, what might be the downside of interacting with people in society? Well, he believed that one of the downsides of being a very sociable person is, again, according to Emerson, that most people are not very wise or very moral. That's right. Emerson believed the majority of people are not very wise or very moral. And what led him to these beliefs? Well, I think the defining issue of Emerson's life was slavery. Slavery was not abolished in the United States by a constitutional amendment until Emerson was in his 60s, so that for most of Emerson's life, slavery was legal. Emerson was an advocate of the abolition of slavery. Indeed, so many of the impassioned speeches Emerson gave in his life were speeches in which he called for the elimination, the abolition of slavery. And I mentioned slavery being a defining issue in his life in this sense, that there's little doubt, no doubt really, that Emerson found it difficult to understand how his fellow Americans could not only tolerate slavery, but approve of slavery. Indeed, even in the North, where Emerson lived, I mentioned he lived most of his life in Concord, Massachusetts, many of the people there were opposed to the abolitionists, opposed to the people who wanted to get rid of slavery. And why so? Well, many Northerners believed the abolitionists were rocking the boat and would eventually create problems between the northern and southern parts of the United States. So again, one of the reasons Emerson came to have a rather low opinion of human nature, and again came to this conclusion that the majority is neither very wise nor very moral, is again because of the fact that slavery was legal for most of his life. Also, another aspect of Emerson's beliefs and his behavior, which led him to criticize the majority, was this. Emerson was not only very upset by how Americans were treating black people, but extremely upset about how Americans were treating the Indians. Indeed, Emerson wrote a letter to President Van Buren at one time opposing the forced removal of a tribe of Cherokee Indians to an area which Emerson believed was kind of uninhabitable. And again, Emerson just believed that the land they were living on was their land, and the United States had no right to do this. So again, when one studies the time in which Emerson lived, and when one understands how Americans were treating blacks and Indians, among others, one perhaps can appreciate Emerson's view of the majority of people. Emerson said this, and I think this is a powerful quote that tells you very much about his stance towards many things. Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Emerson, the former minister, admired Jesus. And what did Jesus have to say on this topic? Well, Jesus said this: conform yourselves no longer to the standards of society. That sounds very much like Emerson, who himself said, whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. And the Buddha also sounds very much like Jesus. The Buddha said this: the world is in darkness, how few have the eyes to see. It is interesting that virtually all the great thinkers in history believed that the majority of people in any society are neither very wise nor very good. Indeed, so much of history has consisted of wars and genocide and people inflicting pain on other human beings. Emerson, in talking about and writing about the morality of the majority, wrote the following, and I'm quoting him: we easily come up to the standard of goodness in society. Society's praise can be cheaply secured, and almost all men are content with these easy merits. Emerson believed that such expressions as "he's a nice guy" or "she has much integrity" are used very loosely by people and very often not accurately. You can be sure that when Emerson was alive, he heard of some slave owners and slave traders and some racist politicians of his time being regarded as good people, nice people, people of integrity. And one can imagine Emerson cringing at the idea that such people would be regarded as good people, as people of integrity. Perhaps the outstanding illustration of this from the time in which Emerson lived would be the contrast in how Southerners thought about Abraham Lincoln, who eventually tried to bring an end to slavery, and their chief advocate, the South's chief advocate, John C. Calhoun. I've mentioned Calhoun in several previous programs. He was a slave owner and the senator, or a senator from South Carolina, a very prominent senator. Indeed, at one time, he was elected vice president of the United States. Calhoun believed that slavery was moral. Indeed, he called it a positive good. He also recommended that at times slaves be whipped, and also, under certain circumstances, that slaves be restricted to a diet of bread and water for at least a week. This man, John C. Calhoun, this advocate of slavery, whom some people saw as a cruel man, indeed Emerson saw him as a very cruel man, Calhoun was extremely popular among Southerners. As I mentioned, he later became vice president. And what about Lincoln? How was Lincoln viewed by Southerners? Again, Calhoun advocated for slavery. Lincoln, early on, when he was running for the presidency, called slavery immoral, called it wicked, and eventually tried to get rid of it. Well, what was the South's attitude towards Lincoln? Well, the majority of Southerners very much disliked Lincoln. In fact, when Lincoln won the presidency in the year 1860, no Southern state voted for him. Again, Lincoln got the electoral votes of no Southern states when he ran for the presidency in 1860 and won. Indeed, when Lincoln won the presidency, he only got about 44% of the popular votes. Well, how did he get elected? Well, he did get a majority of the electoral votes. In fact, let me correct something I just said. I said he got about 44% of the popular votes. It was 40%. He got about 40% of the popular votes, but a majority of the electoral votes. No thanks to the South. Isn't it true that even today, politicians of both political parties often refer to some members of their own party as people of great integrity, when an examination of their careers would show that that designation is just not correct, is just not accurate. Indeed, so many contemporary politicians in America, probably throughout the world, and also in our history, so many politicians, when they campaign for the particular office they're running for, trash their opponent, often telling half-truths about their opponent, sometimes outright lies about their opponent, sometimes engaging in rumor-mongering. And we ought to regard such politicians as being people of integrity, politicians who will trash their opponent to get elected, trash their fellow American to get elected. Emerson believed that since society is likely to confuse people as to what is good and just, we need solitude and silence to do our best thinking. That's right. Emerson believed we need solitude and silence to do our best thinking. He spoke of the necessity of solitude. That's his expression, the necessity of solitude. Emerson wrote about so many of the geniuses in history and also very spiritual people in history who lived very solitary lives and who depended on solitude to help them move to higher levels of awareness, to higher levels of consciousness. And who were some of the people in history who very much cherished solitude? Jesus, Buddha. In more contemporary times, Albert Einstein, the great mathematician and scientist. Indeed, in his autobiography, Einstein talked about his love of solitude. And of course, great writers like Shakespeare and Tolstoy had to be able to enjoy solitude because one writes great plays, one writes great books when one is alone. One does not write great plays and great books when one is in a crowd. Emerson talked about, and I'm using his words now, the folly of too much association. And he said we must come back to the repose of self-trust. Interesting, he uses that term, too much association with other people. Try telling that to people who are addicted to cell phones. I'm talking about Emerson's comments on society and solitude and the advantages and disadvantages of each. Another criticism Emerson made of spending too much time with people is the following. Emerson claimed that so many of our social interactions with friends, acquaintances, and family members are quite shallow. Emerson claimed there is much role-playing, much mask-wearing in our interactions with other people, that many people find it difficult to be sincere and spontaneous. Many people find it difficult to remove the mask. My favorite quote on this idea comes from Marlon Brando, the famous actor. Brando said this about acting, but it's very germane to what I'm talking about now. Brando said, acting is the least mysterious of crafts. Most people do it all day long. I suspect Emerson would agree with that. Here are Emerson's own words on this subject. He talked about, and I'm quoting him, the forced smile which we put on in company where we do not feel at ease in answer to conversation that does not interest us. I think we can all relate to that. The forced smile we sometimes put on, again, in company where we do not feel at home. Emerson raised the possibility that we can be more lonely with other people than when alone. His own words. And I think he said this tongue-in-cheek. I cannot visit the homes of my relatives because I do not wish to be alone. His closest friend, Henry David Thoreau, also commented on this idea that we can be more lonely with other people than when alone. And let me give you a taste of what Thoreau said on this. And again, I'm quoting him. I sat at a table with other people where rich wine and food were in abundance, but I walked away hungry because sincerity was not. Thoreau also said this, I love to be alone. I have never found the companion who was as companionable as solitude. He then went on to say, again, this is Thoreau, we are for the most part more lonely when we go abroad among others than when we stay in our own chambers. It is interesting that Emerson and Thoreau, both of whom cherished solitude so much, were good friends and had a lifelong friendship. Indeed, when shortly before Emerson died, he expressed the idea that Thoreau had been his best friend. Emerson, in talking about the disadvantages of society, also claimed society can intimidate us. He said that sometimes we can fear to express our real feelings and thoughts with other people if we feel we will be criticized for them. Emerson said this, and I'm quoting him, most people are cowed in society. Most people are cowed in society. Emerson believed that at times society can be a bully, especially if one disagrees with what the majority thinks and feels. Indeed, the very famous French writer Alexis de Tocqueville addressed himself to this idea. Tocqueville talked about the tyranny of the majority. The tyranny of the majority. Since Emerson does believe we have a need to interact with other people, what's his solution to the problems it can cause. Well, again, here are his own words, and I think this provides a good summary of how Emerson believed we should handle both society and solitude, and what our attitude should be towards both. Again, I'm quoting him. It is easy to live in the world after the world's opinion. It is easy to live in solitude after our own opinion. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd, keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. Keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. Emerson, despite his preference for solitude, seemed compelled to be a social activist, to be a political activist. Again, despite the fact he loved solitude, remember, he very actively opposed slavery, making many impassioned speeches attacking slavery. I mentioned he was a proponent for Indian rights and often spoke out against the harsh treatment Americans were according the Indians. And also, Emerson, despite the fact he had been a minister for 5 years, was also at times a vitriolic critic of organized religion. And what did Emerson believe should be the proper attitude towards society? Again, here are his own words. The proper conditions are met if we keep our independence, yet do not lose our sympathy. Again, we should keep our independence from society, but not lose our sympathy, our compassion for other people. In other words, the idea is we should not judge another person's sociability by how many friends and acquaintances they have, but rather by how much compassion they have for their fellow human beings. I'll have much more to say about Emerson in my next program, which will be the 6th in this series. But right now, as is my custom, I would like to end with a quotation from Thoreau. Thoreau, in Waldo, in his masterpiece, said we are all artists. His own words, to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.